Good evening. I'm Ron Bodenson, and welcome to the 96th presentation of the Academy Awards. Oh, that Gibbs next month. Sorry, I got confused. Anyway, apparently we have a record turnout tonight, and welcome back to many classmates who joined us in the past and are reconnecting. We glad you're here. This format can be a little different. Our presenter is going to talk for 25, 30 minutes or so. And then halfway through, we're going to have two talking heads, Larry Ricketts and Brian Murphy, interview the presenter. So I think that will be pretty interesting, and there'll be time for questions at the end. As I said, I'm Ron Bodenson. You might remember me from the 50th reunion. I was the one who, before, during, and after, tried to conjure up the class of 1867, who had enjoyed their 50th reunion 100 years before in 1917. I recently looked over that research and realized that almost on this exact date, 100 years ago, in February 1924, the survivors of that class were sitting in their living room and enjoying an iconic presentation, the first ever radio broadcast from the White House, presented by none other than silent Calvin Coolidge, who is a newly elected president. Well, tonight, 100 years later, here we are, and we're going to enjoy, both by listening and watching on devices that are more, how would I say, exotic than radios, a presentation by one of our classmates, who I think you will find is a bit more loquacious than Silent Cal, and who arguably had a more interesting career. We first met Lenny Goldberg at Williams College, where by spring break, our freshman year, he was involved in sit-ins down south and had met Martin Luther King. And in the following college years, we found him strategizing and skiing with Tom Hayden, rubbing elbows with Julian Bond at Baxter, knocking heads with General Maxwell Taylor at Chapin, all the while organizing both local and national marches and protests involving both civil rights and the war. After Williams, Lenny at Berkeley gave up both academic economics and retail politics and forged a career in what he calls being a practitioner of political economics, which he will discuss tonight. And as I introduce him, I want to leave you with a quotation from Bayard Rustin, who many of us have recently met on the big screen. It is a statement that I believe applies to many of the social issues that we have experienced ourselves in the 70 years or so of our lifetimes, such as civil rights, civil and not so civil disobedience, women's rights, gay rights, religious freedom, transgender rights. Sorry, there's someone not on mute, maybe John. Anyway, Rustin's quotation is this: when an individual is protesting society's refusal to acknowledge his dignity as a human being, his very act of protest confers dignity on him. I present to you the dignified Lenny Goldberg. Unmute.
You have to unmute, Lenny. Then, Lenny, you have to unmute. Down at the bottom of your screen.
Or
we shouldn't have had Lenny mute. I can't unmute him, Alan.
there we go.
Okay, there we go. I got it. No problem. Okay. So it's interesting. I got an email about a year ago from Willard Spiegelman. Many of you may remember him from a year before. And he, being very perplexed about politics, asked the question, how is it that you could be doing this all this time, and how do you stay with it? He was an academic and wrote a really nice book recently. And I said, well, and then I had to figure that out and answer him. And a lot of it is from my upbringing, which Myra, my sister who's on here, will appreciate. My father was an immigrant. He was a labor lawyer. My mother, an activist. They came out of the left of the 30s and 40s, and I grew up in the 50s, assimilating into America at Eastchester High School in Westchester County. But I always read, even as a kid, landmark books, a lot of history, and I always felt somewhat as if I wanted or was expected to be an actor in some way in the world. And so that kind of motivated me as I got into college. And Ron, thank you for the intro. I think a very formative piece. I joined the Williams Civil Rights Committee, which my old friend Steve Block had put together, if people remember him. I'm still in very close touch with him. And we went to Morehouse College on an exchange for a couple weeks, spring break, and another week. And Roy, I think you might have been, were you on that trip? Yes. And we sat in Atlanta lunch counters, but they didn't have enough money. We couldn't get arrested. They didn't want to get arrested. We were confronted by Lester Maddox at the Pickwick restaurant, and the good fortune of going to the Ebenezer Baptist Church when Dr. Martin Luther King was preaching, and met him and all that. Now, not like Rich German's Freedom Summer in Mississippi. It was kind of a short foray. But, I grew up in a mostly white environment. I think many of us did. Williams College was a mostly, predominantly, overwhelmingly white environment. So it was really a learning experience. At that point, the Vietnam War was starting up. We organized an SDS chapter at Williams. And looking back at that, the April 2065 March in Washington was actually both inspirational in terms of the people who were there and the speeches that were given, but it also looked back, it was a kind of turning historical event, which was one of the first well-organized marches. Then, we did a two-state peace march. I worked that summer after sophomore year in the Newark Community Union Project, which was, white Jewish college kids in the ghetto. I can't say that we accomplished anything, but I connected with Tom Hayden, who our careers sort of paralleled. He was in Berkeley and then Sacramento, and he was the public face. I was a much more private face. Two-state peace march from Bennington to Williamstown. Some of you may remember. And then Ron mentioned the Maxwell Taylor event, which in fact was, really disturbing because we were just peacefully protesting, and what we saw was propaganda and lies, basically, is what came out of that. And our anger, we found out later that he had never been so badly treated since he'd been at Berkeley. And we all went, yay. So I came to Berkeley in graduate school, and I should say, I don't know if Warren Suss is on here. We traveled around the world with Warren and my first wife, Marilyn Power, who was the daughter of John Power, economics professor. And my notion at that time was to be in development economics and save the world. I kind of learned, as Andy Parnes and others did, that was not too likely to happen. But got to Berkeley and discovered that economics was basically mathematics, and my interest to be in policy and politics and political economy was really kind of stifled, and I wasn't that good at it either, to say, in terms of being a mathematician rather than somebody interested in policy and politics. Berkeley, on the other hand, was very exciting. Brian and I wrote an article for the Williams Record about Stop the Draft Week that we sent back. Lots of stuff going on. I turned my focus into local policy and local issues. And as part of April Coalition, that was a combination of, mostly people on the left. I became the city council candidate for the April Coalition in 1973. I think it was fortunate that I lost. Only one of our slate of four actually won, but it put me back into the world. And even though I was teaching at San Francisco State and at a community college, it really got me to much more directed towards acting in the world. So even though I was getting a little older and my career hadn't kind of moved, oh, actually, after I had turned down a job at Hampshire College teaching economics because I was running for city council at that point. Somehow they found out that I had lost and they got back to me and said, would you like to, and it was a new college, you know, progressive and all that. And I felt I was committed to Berkeley and not committed to being an academic, even in a place like Hampshire, which was a little more progressive. So that was, you know, in this talk, I have various career things that mostly didn't happen. And like not getting elected to the city council, not taking an academic job. So I worked with a local county supervisor who ran for the assembly, and he asked me to come work for him in Sacramento. And and my thought was, sure, I would do that. My first marriage was, we were separating, and I was kind of, former PhD candidate who was working at a low-level staff job for a freshman assemblyman, low prestige, not really too lucrative or any of that. However, when I first got there, there had been these sit-ins about apartheid, and I wrote a letter. This was like the first month of being there. I wrote a letter that was carried around to 35 assembly people, or legislators supporting the students, and which was fine. That was very nice. But then there was this article in the LA Times, and I went, oh yeah, that's what it takes. It was like there it was, all my very words. And at that point, I got the sense of being much more of an actor and an activist. And we did a bunch, it was interesting looking back on it as a legislative staffer. We got money for parks and saved a Berkeley camp, and got it, actually wrote an a bill that created a network of independent living centers for the disabled, mental health treatment. It was actually very productive. And the one thing, here's one that I would point to, and I think the lesson here, and this is kind of for all time, is that in the context of politics, very unappreciated but very influential are staffers, whether it's legislative staff, whether it's White House staff, whether it's state level, or even state local level staff. It actually has a lot of influence. In this case, coming from Berkeley, where there had been a battle over rent control, and this is sort of bookends my career, at that point, Proposition 13, and you'll hear more about this, was the state's anti-tax rollback of property taxes, 2/3 vote for new taxes, a big sweep of very populist anti-tax, anti-government beginnings of a lot of that, leading to Reagan and government being the problem. So it was a very important event. I wrote a bill that required that the benefits, the property tax benefits, be given back to tenants. And of course, the realtors went crazy and they called it statewide rent control. And what we got out of that was a state renter's credit, with, to make up for the losses that they had been, the fact that they hadn't benefited. And the language that we used in the bill that we wrote became the basis for a number of rent control bills statewide. So that was, it was kind of an indication of, hey, you can actually do something. This is really fun. You make a difference even there as a young staffer. Now here was at this point another issue of my career came on the line, as there was a speakership fight, and we were aligned with one person, and I'd worked with his staff, a guy named Howard Berman, who became a congressman. Worked closely with his staff, and I thought, oh, we're going to move right up to speaker staff. I'll be really powerful in a very short time here. And of course, he lost the speakership fight and back to the back benches. So So that yet another career defeat, shall we say, and it's replete with them. So went to at a later point. I was getting too old to be a staffer, and despite the fact that it was a very effective role, and I won't take that back. Um, I moved on. I hung out my shingle as a lobbyist and consultant, and it was the middle of the Reagan era. It was the Duke-Majan era. Well, actually, I mostly faced Republican governors in all my years in Sacramento, which seems odd now, but it was Duke-Majan, Wilson, a little bit of Democrat Gray Davis, and then Arnold Schwarzenegger. So for the many up to 2010, which was the 30 years really I had been working there. Um, and I didn't know exactly what I was going to do. I didn't get a job in the city of Berkeley, which was a good thing. And and again, this was sort of a defining moment in terms of what I was going to do. I had started, I kind of had reorganized a moribund organization, the California Tax Reform Association. I was defending rent control after it had passed for a couple of different cities, and doing landlord-tenant lobbying. And was the Black leadership, the progressive elected officials in Oakland, asked me to run for the North Oakland City Council seat, which is where I was running, where I was living. And at that point, I had two small children and a stepson who was a little older, but it was still a family. And I knew at that point, having worked in the political world for that 5 or 7 or 8 years, I knew the impact it had on one's family life, one's marriage. And my wife, Katie, said she would leave me if I did it. And I kind of understood that, because you're married to your constituents in a situation like that, and you're a very public person. When I mentioned this to my sister, Mara, who's on this, she said after I'd run for city council, I had said, and I don't remember this, but I had said I really was not that happy being in the public eye and being such a public persona. So I did not, Katie may have been, it was a major influence on this, but, and it was a seat I would have won. It was, had been an old line Oakland Council conservative. It was a new area. North Oakland was very progressive. And it was a major decision as to whether or not I wanted to be elected official. And then, gosh, who knows, from the Oakland City Council, I could have gone to the state assembly, right? And it was, or whatever. And it was a kind of a major decision. And I don't regret it, although I do look back at what, you just say, oh, what's an alternative life might have looked like. In any case, I started lobbying in Sacramento, and this was sort of early on. There was a very hard-fought landlord-tenant bill that I was in the middle of, and the realtors started passing around the legislature a copy of a book that I had written a part of called "The City's Wealth," and this nice socialist tract about how we can take advantage of public wealth and public investment. And they passed it around the legislature and said, this guy here, this lobbyist, is a communist. At one point during this fight, I had the very crusty old, very powerful realtor lobbyist said, we had said, I got to talk about this. He said, I don't negotiate with communists. And one of the things I learned, which was pretty, which I really held with me for many, many years, is that you just can't take it personally. The politicians, it's all about them and it's me and my relationship to other people. For me, it was just business, not personal. And I was surprised, actually, looking back on it, that I didn't fold, so to speak, even though they were spreading lies about me all around the legislature. In any case, he did come to the table. We did negotiate because Maxine Waters, who many of you may have heard of, who was a very good friend and supporter in the legislature when she was in the assembly, just kicked butt on the realtors. And we got to the table and actually got a pretty good bill out of it. So it was sort of and then that another learning lesson there is that don't be intimidated. Just go to your support, go to your strength, go to your power. So let's see, where am I now? I got a long story here to illuminate some of the way these issues work. And it's actually, the story basically is that so much of the work I ended up doing, which I think of pushing out the progressive edge, ended up being solving problems that are really stupid and should never happen. In other words, it's fixing government rather than figuring out ways of having a vision to push forward. In this case, it was the state spending limit, which the Democrats, after the tax revolt of 1978 and the passage of Prop 13, they then capitulated on a state spending bill limit, a state spending limit, which was completely irrational. It just locked down government, made it impossible to spend, and they justified it by saying, we've just had such a big tax cut, it'll never come into effect. Well, in the late 80s, it started coming into effect, and the legislature gave back $1 billion to taxpayers and then found themselves billions of dollars in the hole on the budget, and it was, a real problem. So the business community went out to try to get themselves exempt from the state spending limit. And that looked like it was sailing through for roads and transportation and infrastructure. And I felt like I played a major role in mobilizing people to stop that. There were some various serendipitous things that happened that we did that. So then we went to the ballot with a spending limit change, and the Irvine Company went to the ballot with another an alternative bill and measure, and we both lost. And so then in 1990, and this was a kind of a necessity, which for everybody, I would say necessity is the mother of consensus. We managed to put something together in which we negotiated really hard and managed to get a spending limit that basically has disappeared. We rewrote it, put it all full of loopholes. And it was a case where everybody understood that the state and the system was dysfunctional, which, puts me in a funny position. Here I am wanting to push the edge. And basically what we got was a consensus with business on how dysfunctional the spending limit was. Now, there were two tax issues that I felt pretty good about. One was the Republicans wanted a family-oriented tax credit, but most of what they were proposing was going to be for the upper middle class. I was able to come back in with the child tax credit, and everybody said, "Oh, that sounds great." And now we look at the child tax credit that's been in recent years, that was very important. And the result of it was that we knocked, most working families, low and moderate income families, including middle class, knocked them off the tax rolls. Middle class families get a good break. And the analysis have shown that the California tax system, in large part because of that credit, is one of the most progressive in the country. Another one was, and this was, I got it very, very much, my work was involved with the initiative process. Early on, I was part of a losing campaign against an English-only initiative that, Hayakawa had pushed. It actually didn't have any impact, but I was running that campaign quite poorly, I would say, or, we lost anyway. But in the early 90s, the state was in a kind of a crisis, and Pete Wilson put forward a whole bunch of regressive taxes. And we filed, we wrote it. It was labor that was my main support, public sector labor mostly. We wrote and filed an initiative to raise the top brackets of the income tax. And at that point, the whole inequality issue was not quite as much in the forefront. And I remember talking to the head of the Chamber of Commerce about it, who was actually a pretty progressive guy. That's all changed a lot. But and he went to the governor and said, "These guys have raised millions of dollars and they're going to win. And we don't want to do that." So as a result, we got the top brackets of the income tax were passed. by a legislature and a Republican governor, because the Republican governor wanted it. And that was really because of the threat of the initiative process. So it then was, it was temporary. We lost it in 96, and some of the same battles came back many years later when Jerry Brown was in his second term as governor and wanted a mix of taxes, and we put forward an initiative for the top brackets, which actually became the initiative that passed, and now California has among the you know, some of you may not like this, but among the highest taxes on wealthy, on people making over $1 million, of which there are many in California. So that was a fairly successful effort, and it wasn't just, you know, the avoidance of bad. How we doing on time? Because I had a stopwatch that I didn't make start. What are we looking at?
If you can wrap it up, Lenny, in about 7 minutes, then
No,
we'll chat more.
no,
I know
no.
you've got an hour
I've
more
only
to talk.
I've only done 15 minutes so far, right? Isn't that right?
No, you've done almost 25, 30.
No.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're still back in the 90s. Okay, so here's another story about the initiative process. I was representing, well, I'm going to tell two more and then get to Prop 13. One was the disastrous electricity restructuring. My consumer lobbying was for a group that did their advocacy at the Public Utilities Commission, and I was sort of their political watchdog in Sacramento, and we had a lot of gains and a number of some losses, but mostly good. And then the electricity restructuring came along. I would say the rule that I violated was not, you know, I knew that I should know what I don't know, but I didn't know what I didn't know in this case. And we went kind of neutral. We went neutral on it because we were really always fighting with the PG&E and Edison and the whole, you know, as people might remember from this, the whole electricity system went upside down. Enron manipulated it. All this stuff was happening. And so, but the outcome that we were able to get was pretty much to protect small customers, those that used a little bit of electricity, smaller amounts of electricity, not the big users. And that was a fairly successful, but it was quite a battle. And it was, you know, kind of turning everything upside down, and, you know, huge efforts in the legislature and a lot of big fights. I'll bypass the two kind of child advocacy issues that you might want to ask about later. But also I was representing a nonprofit that did privacy rights and privacy coming forward in the aughts, you know, as the internet was growing, and it was or my organizations and we're, you know, very low funded and kind of new to it, but it became we were able to raise issues, and one of the ones was financial privacy, which was allowed for under the restructuring of Graham-Leach-Bliley and the federal level. We did a financial privacy bill in which my understanding from the other side was that there were 125 lobbyists from the financial industries who were working on that. And we were like 3 or 4 of us with Jackie Spear, whose name you might know. She was a state senator and then a congressperson. So there was the person who founded eLoan, a guy named Chris Larson, had a lot of money, and we actually polled and found that privacy was like a North Korean issue. It was like 95% of people wanted really tight privacy. And we circulated an initiative. When we were about to put the signatures in, all the banks and financials came to the table. We negotiated, hammered out a good bill. We got it, and then even if it had been held up for years by the banking industry, it got, as a result of the initiative, it got through, which was just an interesting way of that we had to work the politics, given that we mostly Republican governors. and it passed overwhelmingly and was signed. But the interesting outcome there is that we turned out that was a big mistake. You know, it was like being an insider. We got a good bill. Had we taken it to the ballot and gotten an overwhelming vote for privacy, the issue that we're seeing now in the teens and, you know, coming up and much, much later about, you know, internet privacy that we were raising back then would have been actually pushed much further to the forefront if we'd gone to the voters instead of being insiders and kind of deciding, well, we had a really good bill here and we got overwhelming vote in the signature, and wasn't that a great victory? Well, in historical terms, it was probably a mistake. So it's just interesting, you know, to follow on with things. Okay, so let me get to my sort of my main advocacy that I'm still doing and will be doing till I'm 80 or so. I thought I might be doing it till I was 100. Was that early on I did a report and an analysis. I raised money from a foundation for analyzing Proposition 13, and found that there was one completely indefensible, irrational piece of it, which was it was intended for homeowner protection. What it gave was protection to commercial properties, to large real estate, to basically to Chevron's properties were valued at, is still valued in 1975 dollars. It was loophole ridden. It was bad for land use. It promoted speculation. And when I talked to people like Silicon Valley tax people, they would say, oh yeah, it's a ridiculous policy. You know, we can't justify it. Nobody could justify it. And it became, you know, so in the aughts, we did research. By the 10s and 12, we had the University of Southern California doing a lot of research on it, finding that it was costing cities, counties, and schools tens of billions of dollars, you know, just on the commercial property side. We knew that homeowners were going to be protected forever, but it was really nonsense that the commercial properties would be valued in 1980 or 1985 or even 1975, given the growth of the California economy. Then through a process of, you know, really good leadership on the community organizing side, we got a very broad coalition, but all on the left, which is interesting because, you know, nobody wants to touch Proposition 13, even though they made no sense. So we had a progressive coalition built during the teens, and I kind of gave over a lot of my lobbying practice, on which was privacy and consumer mostly electricity and telecommunications, and even the day-to-day tax work, where there were hundreds of bills that I just didn't want to deal with anymore. And we developed, put in some legislation, a lot of organizing. 2016, we were considering going to the ballot. We didn't. And then we went in 2020. And, you know, our pollster said, we need 7.9 million votes in order to win. And we got 8.3 million votes. But as you all know, the 2020 election was among the highest turnout that anybody had seen, and it was a very heavy Republican turnout. They flipped some congressional seats that had been won in 2018. And, you know, we lost big in Orange County and San Diego and San Bernardino. We didn't do as well in LA County that we should have. And as a result, we lost by 2 percentage points. It was a 51-49. And so I was expecting to finally, you know, triumph in my career as having, you know, gotten something big and major done. And it wasn't that I didn't get anything done in the past, but we lost it. So we're not going in 24, but we are going to file early for 2026. And I think we want it to be really a prominent issue now in California, which is having significant budgetary problems, and which, you know, we will hopefully have built way more consensus and coalition than we've had in the past. So I skipped over a bunch of really interesting things, except it's all policy wonk stuff to you guys, probably to many of you. but you know, I was called on the Prop 13 issue. There was a blog that said I'm tilting at windmills. Tom Hayden called it my white whale. But you know, hey, we're you know, and I would often say, well, I'll be 100 before I'm going to retire when this gets done, and I might be working till I'm 100, but hopefully just working till I'm 81 or maybe 82, because we have to follow up when it passes. You know, it's just interesting that my father had said, you know, you live in your times. And, you know, I feel like a lot of what I did was like fixing things rather than, you know, really pushing stuff forward. But you live in your times, you do what you can do. You know, I had a lot of fun at it and I'm still enjoying it. So I think my time has run out. Thank you.
Larry?
Well, we're going to take this from a little chat for 10 or 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Brian has a unique perspective, obviously, on Lenny having and also in California, and has questions and perspectives of chatting with Lenny. The reason I wanted to chat with Lenny before you ask questions, uniquely or not so uniquely, two of my best friends were national lobbyists. One was president of the American Pediatric Association, who helped testify and get the children's health insurance program started. And the other one was a safety lobbyist I just saw in California for General Motors, and did you'll probably in every state, you remember what was it, Click It or Ticket program he did that got seatbelts in cars. And very interesting perspectives. And finally, here locally, one of my best friends is the chief lobbyist for Colorado ceasefire and started that. And we're about to have two bills in the Colorado legislature. Nationally, we'll get a lot of recognition, like Prop 13 will get, for getting rid of assault weapons, making them illegal in Colorado. She's worked her whole life and has banged her head against NRA and others, so it'll be interesting for that. So I wanted to ask Lenny to start off with, you know, you've been in the business of lobbying for a long time. You tried to tell your whole career for public interest for some years. I'm curious, in your mind, over that career, how much have things changed from education and persuasion to the newer methods of rich people buying politicians and issues, and also social media? How has it changed for you?
I can't talk about social media, but I would say they were always bought. That I don't think that's changed. You know, the example I gave of the financial privacy legislation. You know, we were just locked up in the banking committees in both houses all the time. We never got any support, and it was not because of the, you know, and we would, you know, drag out our polling numbers and say 95% of the people think this should happen, and they didn't care. You know, it was completely locked down by the banks and the financials and the, you know, all the investment community, until, you know, we had counterpower. Our counterpower was going to the voters. And by going to, you know, by getting those signatures paid for by a rich guy who was, you know, founded E-Loan at the time. It was like 2002 or 3, and it was pretty innovative, and he made a lot of money, and he followed financial privacy. And it was not until we had those signatures ready to put on the table that would have cost the banks, you know, 50 million or so or 100, you know, in a campaign, and they would have lost, that we had the counterpower to that. So, you know, that was 25 years ago, and or 20 years ago, I guess, 2003. And, you know, it was the money was in there. I made a point as a lobbyist of never, you know, people were totally in telecommunications. AT&T ran the show, and they gave a lot of money to the leadership of both houses and both parties. And, you know, we had very little traction, and I made a point of just trying not to know. I would go in there talking the issues and saying, and I would have people tell me saying, oh, I agree with you, but I can't go there.
So that's interesting that you would make that comment. So a lot of my local lobbyist friends and issues now, they're all turning to younger social media people to help them with their lobbying campaigns, especially like Prop 13. So you're not looking to
Oh yeah,
social media.
no, we do, we have a lot. I mean, I'm the oldest guy around now, and what's very gratifying is a very multicultural, multiracial, young coalition of community groups and people who are, it's very gratifying because they say, when are we going after this commercial property thing again? And so they use social media fully.
Okay.
So it's definitely got to be part of a campaign. At the time,
Brian?
our version of that was kind of getting signatures
Yeah.
on initiatives.
Brian? You're on mute.
Lenny, I have a nostalgia question. In all of this work, was there ever an occasion walking down the hall to a committee meeting, coming out of one, where you ever thought about a Williams College professor or a Williams College class and thought to yourself, wow, I remember, this is about that?
Well, what I think and I said this a little earlier, what I think I got at Williams, I mean, aside from the substance, and well, I think a lot of the economics and the policy, was there. But what I did think was that I was often running from committee to committee, and I had to be really quick on my feet as people asked questions, and what do you think of this section of the bill? And I think my having the small classes, whether it was Bob Gaudino or others who were saying, Mr. Goldberg, what's your idea about that? That I think Williams really helped in becoming quickly articulate about issues that I didn't know anything about. No, that's not exactly right. That's just a joke. But I did, did have to learn, and I did appreciate it from Williams that I'm not actually graduate school was more lecture classes than Williams ever was. And I think the ability, the need to react on your feet and be quick and be prepared. I do think a lot of that came from there.
No, the other question I had was simply, unless Larry, you have one?
No, go ahead. I've got one more. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I'm just intrigued. I'm sure, like others on the screen, depending where you're coming from, and Lenny has a unique perspective of the concentration of money in the hands of a few because of tax policy. And talk a little, just quickly, what you've seen over your career of barriers to changing tax policy for better public policy.
No, well, thank you. I'm such a policy wonk. I love that question.
Well, don't get lost in the weeds. I want the big picture.
I would make the distinction, and this was not a setup. I did not know this was coming. The distinction I would make in terms of success and failure is that as personal income tax, we did really pretty well in terms of, capital gains are taxed the same as ordinary income. Which, as they say, causes volatility in the state's tax system. But California, compared to other states, has always been highly progressive. Where we failed was particularly with Silicon Valley and particularly on the corporate side. Actually, here's another 40-year failure, which when I was in the legislature, we introduced an oil severance tax. And California is the only place in the world, this is progressive blue state California, the only place in the world that doesn't have an oil severance tax. And I traveled to conferences. I went to Alaska. I actually made a little policy tweak at the federal level that was quite successful. And I learned a whole lot about oil, but we still, with 2/3 vote requirement, the power of the oil lobby, we couldn't get it through. Kern County, Kevin McCarthy is, he was an assemblyman back then, rooted in Bakersfield and the heart of oil country. And on the corporate side, an early battle that I lost was the way in which, and it was a pretty obscure set of issues, the way in which we tax multinational corporations, water's edge or worldwide taxation. Brian's friend, John Vasconcellos, and I negotiated on that, and I thought I was doing well, but it turned out it didn't matter. We got rolled. And then later, single sales factor, which anybody who follows, state tax policy knows is a big issue. We lost that. I battled 10 years with Amazon to collect sales tax because they had tons of presence in California, but they managed to obscure it and hide it. And we had bills that the Governor Davis, the one Democrat I worked under, vetoed a bill that we got to him about taxing Amazon on sales tax. We finally got it, but that was when Amazon was changing their operations. So they wanted to put, a lot of warehouses in California, and they could not, and continue to justify not collecting sales tax. My client on that were the independent booksellers, and that was really fun. But they were not. They were the powerful and dauntless independent booksellers.
Yeah.
We actually, we lost to Amazon year after year, and the Board of Equalization and all that. So the corporate side, I would say they use the whole business climate. We move out of the state.
Yeah.
Multinational taxation, how we allocate income. We did not do too well on that. On the personal income tax side, people really don't have a problem taxing billionaires and millionaires. And, the numbers show they don't move out of the state.
We've got starting to get a lot of hands up, so we'll let Brian, if he's got one more comment, and then we'll go to Ron. We'll go to questions from the group. Brian?
Just as you know, Lenny, from another story, I was actually in the room in Silicon Valley with John when we were trying to persuade business to come up with some backfill to make up the difference on the loss of the unitary tax. And I swear to God, you were talking about it as if they were talking about it as if we were asking them to sell their children. I mean, it was absolutely existential. The depth of ideology that you had to run into, I'm intrigued by the way you phrase this. So I don't know whether I'm asking a yes or no question, but not so much an elaboration. This sort of fantasy that the sort of grand social good comes from basically business not being taxed and having its way. It's almost impossible to imagine what empirics would change that point of view. The huge inequality of the state might be a beginning.
How could it be yes or no? I'm a master of elaboration. But no, I would say on the commercial property side, where it's so irrational and yet they hold so tight to it, that there are potential offerings that we can make, like getting rid of the business equipment tax. So, there have been some weaknesses that you can exploit from time to time. But, I think Larry's question was right on point, that the issue
Sally.
on
Sally.
on corporate taxation is much different from the issue of taxing the rich.
I think if somebody's not muted.
I got it.
I think it's Peter.
Peter, I'll get him. I'll get him, I think. I know Greg Meister had his hand up first, Ron, if you didn't see it. There's a group of hands up. I think I'll look at the list if Alan doesn't see it. But Greg, you're on. If you unmute and go for it.
Hey, Lenny.
Hi, Greg.
If we were in college today, what would we be protesting?
I don't know. I think all these identity questions, of course, Williams were all a bunch of old white guys. But, I think it's inequality, and it's interesting. I definitely think it's inequality in terms of my economic issues. And that is a good question, because when I went to graduate school and I said I was interested in inequality, they would say, well, that's a moral and philosophical, not an economic issue. And now I think we know very well that it's an economic issue and a big political issue. And I'm not quite, I always, the question is, how do you organize around economic issues like taxes, which has sort of been my You know, it's like hard to mobilize. Who's for taxes? You know, nobody likes taxes. And so the question on inequality, I think is what, at least if I were in college right now, you know, I would be working on. And I think there's been a lot of good work done on it, actually, much more so than in our time.
I think the next person with their hand up is Rich Gehrman, but I say, Lenny, nobody likes taxes, but everybody likes good schools, good roads, good
Exactly.
police. So go ahead, Rich.
Exactly. I would have trouble explaining to when my kids would, you know, what does your dad do? Well, he's for taxes, right? It's a little hard to answer that question.
Well, Lenny, you said you had two child advocacy issues that you had to skip over, but I'd like to ask you about them now.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Okay, well, one was, I think, you know, one of them, I represented family service agencies and child abuse treatment programs, and we were able to define child abuse, even without a police report, as victims of crime. And that there was a big pot of money for victims of crime. So we opened up that pot of money for the child abuse treatment. A funny story about that is that my main client on that, or at least the most prominent client on that, but also the director was wonderful, was the Barbara Sinatra Children's Center in Palm Springs. And so we got, you know, quite a number, you know, be with Barbara Sinatra. Somebody thought that when we had a call into the Senate floor, they said, "Oh, Frank Sinatra's calling." It wasn't quite that, but it was a very successful way of really funding child abuse treatment through the Victims of Crime program. The second one was the child support system was a complete wreck. It was run by the district attorneys who were very entrenched and powerful, but could care less about child support. And there were actually a foundation funded, you know, my lobbying, the advocacy at the grassroots level, press work, which exposed in the LA Times, they were up for, I think they might have even won a Pulitzer Prize for exposing how bad the DAs were running the child support system. And the result is that we were able to, you know, crush the district attorney effort and actually make structural change. It was one of the rare times where we were able to do structural change, and we actually got a child support system that we never hear of anymore because it works, you know. And it was a case, a typical case where it took the advocates and us pushing from the outside. And of course, the president of the Senate, John Burton, hated the district attorneys. So that was a big help. But, you know, there was a lot of serendipity. The legislators came together on it. The press had worked on it. And we actually took the whole program away from the DAs and got a reason to set up. One of the staffers who worked the bill became the head of the Department of Child Support Services. So thanks, Rich. Those were two pretty successful stories.
Great, great. Thank you. Yeah.
I think
That's good.
Ted, you may be up next.
Ted, you have to,
Yeah.
you got
Okay.
it.
Lenny, thank you so much for sharing your life experiences and the unique versatility of your skills, the range of effective behavior, your depth of knowledge, and your applied passion is really a unique combination. I just want to congratulate you on a life well lived.
Oh, well, thank you. I actually think, as Brian asked, I think, you know, my education had a lot to do with it. In the later years, I focused on economic issues, and people really didn't, you know, I was able to have a pretty good advantage on that. You know, and the other thing is that there are some places where, like, I figured out stuff, then put stuff together, like on the child abuse and victims of crime, to get a lot of money into programs. But I would say, you know, the process is a very collective effort. And when I started off saying, you know, how important staff was during the electricity crisis, the ability to protect ordinary customers, ordinary ratepayers. You know, there were some like just key staff interventions that helped that. And, you know, not to mention the legislators who took up your issues. So, you know, it is a very, thank you for the comments. You know, and I like to take credit for stuff, but it really is a very collective process. So,
Well, other people are thinking and have questions. I want to follow up on Ted's. Lenny, a lot of progressives in their arena either get tired or sell out. Take even some of the people you mentioned along the way have sold out for money or otherwise. What keeps you motivated for still a passionate public policy advocate?
well, you know, I actually think there were a lot of mistakes. You know, when the issue Brian was talking about, you know, I kind of tried to negotiate a compromise, which was worse than that. So I don't know if it's not selling out, but there, you know, in the electricity crisis, I convinced some people said, oh, you know, we just got to oppose this whole bill. And I said, oh, no, we should go neutral on it because we got a lot of gains, which turned out to be mythical. And so, you know, I would say the selling out question is kind of contextual, shall we say. It's that you're not selling out, but you're agreeing to something that when you look back on it, you probably shouldn't, like dropping our privacy initiative. You know, oh yeah, we got a good bill. This is being you know, in a way, the selling out, it's not like you're giving in to the other interests, but you're making tactical and strategic mistakes because you're too much of an insider rather than seeing the broader perspective. So I think there's, you know, it's a lot of many decisions along the way. Do I go along with that bill or do I try to kill it? You know, it's on, and it's kind of every day, as opposed to some. Now there are people who go to the other side, but there weren't too many of them. There's a really good group of public interest advocates. Alan, I don't know if you talked to your brother, your cousin Bob Stern, who's done, you know, fair political practices and common cause for years and years. I would say, you know, people keep going because it's, you know, it's fun, and it wasn't like I wasn't making a living. Although actually, there was one time where I was joined up with the oil companies, and that was a big mistake. It wasn't selling out, but it was a big mistake. I won't go into the detail.
Can you see Huff? I think has got his hand up.
Yep. Lenny, I was just trying to figure out how you figure out with all the things that you've been working on, what's next, and how that process has worked for you. It seems to me that there's so much that's going on. How do I say this is where I need to focus?
You know, for me, it's just the one issue left. I'm sort of peripherally working on a really bad another anti-tax initiative that is being put forward by the Business Roundtable. But it's kind of peripheral work at this point. You know, my main focus is my one big issue, my white elephant, or my, you know, tilting at windmills. At this point, I stopped walking the halls probably, oh, you know, 8 or 10 years ago. When I hit 70, maybe everybody was too young. You had to learn a whole batch of new people. You know, I knew a lot of people, but then they turn over, and the question is, do you want to commit yourself to doing this? The staffers were like kids. And so I left working I left walking the halls, so to speak.
Well, and referring to what's next, I was just saying, when you through your whole life, it was okay, what am I going to be going into next? And I think there's a process that obviously got you to do what you were doing, and a commitment to it. But it was just when you have a whole lot of people coming at you as a lobbyist, where do you put your you personally? Where do you put your heart to say this is what I want to do?
Well, it was basically having good clients. You know, the group at the Public Utilities Commission, you know, were fighting for ratepayers, and they actually did a lot on renewables too. And so, you know, it was basically militated or determined by the clients I was working for, the California Tax Reform Association, I had to focus on, hundreds of bad and stupid tax bills, not focus on, but be in the committees all the time. The the electricity and telecommunications issues, the privacy issues, my children's advocacy clients. So it really was a question of choosing clients, although mostly what I found is that you compete for clients, but the ones you get are the ones that you know well, and the ones you don't get are the ones you don't know. So it was that what determining what I would do next was, what was coming at me on the agenda for the different clients that I had. And some of it was using some creative powers. I thought that, I brought the franchise tax board even before we reformed it into collecting child support. So that, and that was my tax interest in my child. So there were some synergies in my different clients that allowed me to cross over. But in terms of making the decisions, and it's a, good question. It really was determined by kind of what was on the agenda and what did my clients want to see. We would introduce bills, but we'd also have to fight bills or join in on other bills.
Before Ron calls on Brian, I just want to tell you, Lenny, that you're not done yet, because if you're successful on Prop 13, you're coming to Colorado and helping us with the Bruce Amendment and Tabor. Many states have the same things.
I definitely have a professional interest in that, and I thought that Jared Polis did a pretty good job of putting together, property tax relief with relief on the spending limit. Oregon, where I live now, has the same thing, a kicker where they have to give money back even when even when we've paid the taxes, we get the stupid money back. We don't expect that, and instead, education is really screwed up in the state.
Sorry, Brian. I had to tell him he's not done yet.
No, but I'm not doing that much in Oregon either. So
I find this a very interesting story of a life in public policy where you win some, you lose some, and you keep trying to nudge things in a certain direction, and eventually things move that way. But I wonder if you have any insights when we look at the national stage where things are there's no compromise. It's, I'll cut off my nose to spite my face. I want a bill on this, but I won't vote for it if the other guy's voting for it. Any ideas? How do we get out of this mess?
Well, the problem with working all these years in public policy is that I'm a stupid optimist. You couldn't stay in it unless you thought there were some ways of, moving forward. You had to be optimistic about it. So I think the Democrats will take the House. And I think even if the Senate is sort of equally divided, there'll be some, there'll be some movement there. They're not quite as hardline as the House. And, God knows about the presidential. It's interesting. I always worked on issues, and I did not work on personal campaigns very much at all. I followed them, obviously, and I had to know who I was going to be dealing with. But, in my case, I was sort of playing the hands I was dealt, which were not very good a lot of the time. But I have a little, my optimism is that we're going to get through this, and the House is going to flip, and the Senate will be tight, but, that'll be a little more reasonable. And I can't speak to a system where, 10,000 votes in 5 different states determine the entire election. Right?
Lenny, it's Ron. In Connecticut, and I don't know if this is true in other states, but when I give a political contribution, I have to fill out a form, and the form says, "Are you a lobbyist?" And I check no. Then it says, "Is anyone in your household a lobbyist?" Check no. And then it's sort of the third one, "Are you really sure? Because if you are, we need to know." And then you make the contribution. I suppose if I said I was a lobbyist, maybe I could make the contribution. What do you see this throughout the country as far as disclose
right
your
now,
lobby.
right now I'm a consultant, and I'm actually not doing any lobbying. I'm not a registered lobbyist, but you know, it reminds me whenever Katie had to fill out a form like spouse's occupation, she had a little bit of trouble with it. She said, well, she would say public interest advocate or something like that. A little difficult admitting, I was kind of an oxymoron. I was a public interest contract lobbyist, where contract lobbyists, there are always those who, take whoever comes along. I took a number of public interest organizations, and now there are some of them, but at the time it was a kind of an unheard of practice.
So I could put an asterisk, I'm a lobbyist, but public interest, and I could make a contribution, not go to jail. Okay. Well, any other questions? Are we ready to wrap up? Mr. Ricketts, you have any final comments?
No, I'm just so, as the rest of you would be.
John 1A has a question.
Okay, good. John, are you unmuted?
Yeah, we have one thing in common. We were both conscientious objectors.
All right, there is that.
Vietnam War. And I have just moved up to Poughkeepsie out of New York City. And I'm really finding the awareness about the war is zero. And I'm very frustrated. I just wondered, not a question of what do you think should be done, but how many people are concerned about the war in the Middle East?
I don't know. I have definitely, as a Jewish American, I'm really concerned about the right wing, ultra right wing Israeli government, really ultra right wing Israeli government. I think the issue with the Vietnam War, we were all very involved because it was us. I lost my draft deferment when I went to graduate school, and I got a conscientious objector in large part because my parents had moved to New York City, and in large part because there were a lot of Black and Puerto Rican young people who were filling up the quota, and they didn't have a problem giving me a CO. It was very much a class thing, and I think that there are many of our classmates who were in the military. Pete Watson has an interesting story because he was a Navy doc and just couldn't put up with it. I think he might have told that story when he was presenting. So yeah, no, it's bad. It's bad. The difference is, of course, and that was true in the Clinton administration and in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, that we're not been sending the troops, and we don't have a draft. So Iraq and Afghanistan, these were people who signed up for that. And, I think it makes a huge difference from our day. I remember one of the things I was yelling at Maxwell Taylor was, how could you be sending me off to kill and be killed? And that was the circumstances of that time versus this one. I think people don't feel the direct personal connection.
All right, one final question, Jack Hunt.
Just a little bit yet. Can you hear me? Just a little bit yet. Lenny, I lived in Bakersfield for 15 years running Tejon Ranch.
Yeah, I know that.
And when a couple of times we were in meetings and things, mostly politically oriented, and I think the first time I mentioned you and I were classmates, their question was, where the hell did you go to school? You were not a popular person in Bakersfield, and I could certainly hear that in your voice. But I do want to say that my oldest daughter graduated from a public high school, West High in Bakersfield, and ended up at Williams magna cum laude. So Bakersfield's not all bad. There's wonderful people there, and I spent a lot of time on political issues on behalf of Tejon Ranch, and heard your name a lot. Sometime in vain, sometime with great admiration for how effective.
Never with admiration, I'm sure.
Anyway, enjoyed hearing you tonight or today.
So we had a measure on the ballot that was designed to to soak up a lot of campaign contributions that would otherwise go to Pete Wilson's effort to cut welfare. And we had oil severance tax in that. So I remember landing at the Bakersfield airport and having a whole bunch of press out there saying, you guys are going to wreck the oil industry. It was, there was some debate. I'd been in Bakersfield a bunch of times. I actually went to their, the paper was really good. And I went to their editorial board on on probably 5 or 6 occasions on initiatives, mostly ones we were opposing. But I did like the Bakersfield, what's it called? What was the name of the newspaper, Jack?
The John Wayne Tribune.
Daily Californian, I think.
No, the Bakersfield. Yeah. Anyway, I like their editorial staff, and I did spend some time. Made some rounds in Bakersfield on.
They were okay. I did have the privilege to sue Chevron while I was there. So.
Oh, okay.
We were on the same side on something. Anyway.
And you guys did a great job developing that whole area, the Grapevine.
Yeah, I actually did the general plan amendment to get that started.
I'm sure.
Gone way beyond me now.
I'm sure. Well, they need to pay their fair share of property taxes.
Thank you, Lenny. Very interesting presentation. And we're going to segue to John Huffnagle, who's going to talk about next month's.
Let me say one thing. I really would like to, there's so many people here that I'd really love to talk to, unfortunately, or talk with. Unfortunately, the Zoom setup doesn't give you that opportunity.
Well, Lenny, if you hang on towards the end, maybe some of those folks will stay on and you can chat with them.
Lenny, thank you very much for tonight. That was just really a terrific presentation. And what I find is through all of our various presentations, the humility that we are possess after going through different things in life. And you were just, I don't know how you, working in this particular field, how you maintain the optimism that you have. And I think one of the things that's always fun is when all of us say what our mistakes were that actually moved us on. And I just think you did an excellent job tonight. And thank you very much. Our next presentation is going to be on March 21st. And it's going to be Rick Ackerley. And really making school educational is what Rick is going to be doing. I don't know whether you want to say a word or two, Rick, but we're really excited to have you be doing that for us in March.
Well, I don't have too much to say about it. I love seeing you guys. I love these meetings, and it's always educational. And yeah, I hope to see you all here next month.
We hope we all hope that.
Send out an email, I presume.
Let's not conflict with the Academy Awards. Okay?
Well, thank you all for being here tonight too. It's just a great turnout, and Lenny, I think you produced a really great turnout. That's really fun to see.
Well, it was fun. It was really nice seeing people, and as I said, I'd really like to talk with all of you.
Well, that's one of the things that I think this has done, and we've talked about it as we've gotten together and putting all of the presentations together, is people, if they're traveling a little bit, are more apt to stop in and say hi. And I think that's really just a great outcome for all of us, because we're a little closer because of this.
Lenny, I just would tell everybody, the Williams directory does have your telephone number and your email.
Yep.
People can pick up a phone and talk to you like I did.
Right.
Okay.
Say, Huff, on an unrelated topic, real quickly, I and probably others really appreciated the fiscal year 23 class report on the class of 1967 that you all as class officers sent out 2 weeks ago. I thought it was very informative and certainly more routinely prepared than my report following at the 55th reunion. So I thought it was a well done piece of work and appreciated receiving it.
Thank you, Ted. All right, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Bodie.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lenny. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Ron.
Okay, take care. Good evening.
And if you want to stick around and talk for a couple of minutes, we'll leave the Zoom connection open.
I'll hang out, Lenny, just to say hello again.